Good morning, everybody. My name is Brody Fisher. I'm a professor at Northwestern University and beginning this fall here at the University of Chicago in the History Department. It's a great pleasure to be here to introduce this panel, The Politics of Hazard. Really interesting papers, and I think we'll have a lot to talk about collectively and individually. I'd like to begin just by thanking Ayala for including me in this program, and also to all of the organizers for bringing such an interesting and dynamic group of people together. I'm going to go ahead and introduce each of our participants just very briefly, and then they will go through their papers in the order in which I introduced them, which will be slightly different than the order in which it appears in the program. And then I'll try to keep my comments relatively brief so that we'll have some time for discussion and get on to lunch more or less on time. So just to go through our participants, the first will be Nate Millington, who is a graduate student in geography, I hope I've got all of this correct, at the University of Kentucky. And he's going to speak to us about impermeable assemblages, flooding, environmental hazards, and stormwater politics in Sao Paulo, as you can see on his lovely slide here. Then we're going to skip straight ahead to Jay Souza, who's a graduate student in the anthropology department here at Chicago and one of the organizers of this fine panel and this fine program. And he is going to speak about Sao Paulo, Pink City, queer protests, and the color of political dissent. Sarah Brooks, who is an associate professor of political science at Ohio State University, is going to speak to us about insecure democracy, risk, and political participation in Sao Paulo and Recife. And then finally, Leo Cardozo, a graduate student in ethnomusicology at the University of Texas at Austin, is going to close us out by talking about sound politics in Sao Paulo, Brazil, youth, and pancadões. So thanks so much for being here, and we look forward to all of these papers.
Hi. Hi, thanks for being here. Yeah, this is my paper. So I should note, this is a paper that comes out of a dissertation proposal, and so it's a really kind of preliminary project in a variety of ways, both empirically but also linguistically. So it's been a real treat to be here kind of learning from you all, and I look forward to kind of further conversation. I'm in the process of developing this, so I mean, any suggestions, comments, critiques are all welcome, so please feel free over email or in person. Can folks hear me okay? So as many of you know, in December and January of every year, rainfall surges out of channelized rivers and inundates Sao Paulo. While flooding is experienced by all residents, its effects are unevenly experienced due to class and residential geography. Flood's effects range from serious inconvenience for the residents of wealthier central neighborhoods to the possibility of real devastation for residents of the periferia. In 2010, for instance, the community of Jardim Romano, on the far eastern fringe of the city, was flooded for nearly 2 months, resulting in confrontations between residents and the police over the lack of a response by the municipal government. So in this paper, I consider how flood prevention is being imagined by policymakers, urban designers, and architects. Specifically, I focus on the question of permeability and assess the ways that a new permeable city is being visualized, imagined, and constructed by engineers, urban designers, and residents. This looks a lot like Sao Paulo, right? As flooding is an increasingly visible problem in the city, one that only promises to grow due to the kind of processes of climate change as well as the city's own microclimate, there's a series of strategies that are being deployed with the goal of reducing the city's impermeability and making the city more into kind of a sponge. So these spongy urban imaginaries, I think, carry the possibility of a more sustainable relationship between the city and its watershed, one that employs the infrastructural functions of natural systems to corral stormwater, improve water quality, and lessen the risk of flooding. In these ways, these new imaginaries of a more permeable city are suggestive of the partial emergence of what we could call green infrastructure, attempts to accommodate stormwater through multi-use retention ponds, linear parks, and green floodplains. These forms of flood prevention demonstrate a shift in flood prevention policy that breaks with the past century of stormwater management in the city, but also in a kind of global sense. Rather than attempt to move water out of the city through further river channelization, green infrastructural interventions rely on natural systems to do the work for them. In Sao Paulo, low-intensity or green strategies for water management are slowly starting to be used by engineers and urban designers interested in combating flooding. But while environmental interventions into urban landscapes are often framed as politically neutral, or we could even say post-political, to borrow the language of contemporary European political sort of theory, this paper instead considers the politics of these projects. Given Sao Paulo's widely noted inequality, and socio-spatial polarization, there's a distinct risk that the most marginal or precarious urban residents will be forced to bear the brunt of resettlements and evictions that are a necessary component of many of these infrastructural interventions. As Ivan Valen has noted, landscape interventions by necessity have to be forcefully extracted from the landscape. Subsequent to this paper, I consider the nature of these extractions as part of a broader project dedicated to assessing the politics of what geographers and others call the more-than-human city. As this is a tentative foray into a broader dissertation project, this paper is largely concerned with the kind of representational or discursive dimensions surrounding flood policy in the city and their relationship to green infrastructure. So in the paper to come, I first analyzed the city's history of flood prevention, focusing primarily on the mayorship of Francisco Prestes Maya in the 1940s. Second, I consider contemporary imaginaries of a more permeable city that are currently being articulated. And finally, I conclude with some thoughts about the discursive entanglement between informality and environmental degradation that appears within calls for greener or more sustainable contemporary cities. So Sao Paulo is largely at the confluence of three rivers, the Chiaté, the Pinheiros, and the Tamanduateí, amongst a variety of small-scale tributaries that are largely buried beneath the city. The first infrastructural interventions made into the city's drainage infrastructure occurred in 1810, a date which indicates that both this has been a long-standing problem and there's been long attempts to kind of deal with water through infrastructural means. Exceptional rain events were noted as back as 1569 and continue to reappear, as we saw dramatically in the last few months. The first rectification work on the Tamanduateí began in 1848, and by 1914, significant portions of the river that flowed through the city had been channelized. Over the course of the 20th century, all of Sao Paulo's rivers would be further canalized, rectified, channelized. And I think this is from 1897. You can see the Chiaté's kind of sinuous natural course as it's slowly being kind of rectified and normalized. And here you can see that really dramatically. And that's from 1897. The reason for early river rectification, concerns about sanitation played the primary role in modifications made to the city's waterways. The bulk of the city's early industrialization of its rivers was oriented around sanitation concerns, as many of these were kind of slow-moving channels that functioned as sewers. But the most dramatic changes would occur under the mayorship of Francisco Prestes Maya in the 1940s. Under Maya's plan for radial avenues in the city, river floodplains and valleys were increasingly integrated into the city's emerging rail and traffic infrastructure. Given the constraints imposed by the city's built environment already at the time, the floodplains of the cities were kind of sensible locations for putting in roads. These persist today in the Marginal Chiaté, for instance. So this period marked the high point of what in geography we might call an industrial or a Promethean approach to water management, one predicated on a logic of containment and large-scale infrastructural interventions. For Phil Jones and Neil MacDonald, the water management strategies employed by Maya are representative of water management strategies that, in a kind of Foucauldian vein, stress repression rather than production. They attempt to channel water out of the city through the central principle of rapid transit and one particular disciplinary apparatus, the pipe. The danger of water management strategies that attempt to control fluvial processes through piping and channelization is that they raise the risk of catastrophic failure, given the inherent unpredictability of precipitation and the precariousness of infrastructural systems. In the case of Sao Paulo, the combination of a particular socio-technical regime around water alongside changing climatic conditions has resulted in considerable flood activity. But since around 1998, efforts to cohere the city's drainage infrastructure have developed largely through a series of strategic plans. The most recent is the 2012 Manual de Drenagem, produced through a collaboration between the mayor's office and an engineering firm. The manual is a part of a broad effort to systematize the city's ability to deal with flooding, and it involves sort of the creation of a geospatial database to kind of cohere flood risk. And this will be aided by a few infrastructural shifts, including the continued construction of the much-loved retention ponds called piscinões. These are large pools that are designed to collect water when it overflows. Around 60 of them have been built. There's plans for about 100 to be built eventually. These are at their best a kind of mimicry of natural systems that provide green space and sometimes community space, but at worst they're just big pools that fill up with water when it rains. In a sense, they're a bridge between the kind of Promethean approaches of channelization and contemporary interest in green infrastructure. They keep water in the city, but they do so kind of at the expense of it. They build these massive voids that sort of don't serve much function beyond what they do. But so alongside the development of further piscinões has been the creation of parks and green spaces, which will play the double role of accommodating floodwaters as well as providing for urban amenities and green space. Currently, the citywide municipal drainage plan has called for the development of 36 linear parks to run alongside rivers, concentrated largely in the periferia, and perhaps demonstrated best by the Parque Varzias do Chiaté, which is here on the city as a proposed plan. Upon completion, the park will be the longest linear park in the world, stretching east along the Chiate. Designed by Hui Otaki, the park boasts recreational spaces as well as ecological benefits in the form of stormwater containment and hopefully flood prevention. These are specifically designed to correct for the kind of Promethean approach to water management, and they provide sort of green space alongside a kind of infrastructural function. Rather than flush water out of the city, the idea is that you use natural systems to kind of keep it in. But in certain cases, these projects are as much imaginative as they are practical, as in the case of the Watery Voids or Vazios de Agua project, produced by MMBB Architects and the winner of the 2007 Rotterdam Biennale. For MMBB architect Francisco Gemello Franco, who's now the Secretary of Urban Development in the city, infrastructure needs to be, quote, urbanized, and the starting point is the retention ponds or piscinões that are being built throughout the city. In the Watery Voids project, the idea is to open them up to public deliberation, to find ways of making them into deliberative community spaces that are both infrastructural as well as social. These ideas have been put to work in the Antonico Creek Urban Project, a design that uses a surface canal to both provide an infrastructural function while also offering green space for residents of a peripheral comunidade. And also there's a similar project that's proposed now in Vila Madalena. This is the Corrego Verde project, a linear park that provides for flood prevention and water retention in a similar kind of manner. So a final and even more imaginative example of these sorts of projects can be found in the City Floodings Workshop from 2010, a collaboration between the Columbia Graduate School in Architecture and Planning, the Netherlands Institute for Architecture, and the Escola da Cidade in Sao Paulo. So these lack the sophistication of the Watery Voids project, I suppose, but they're interesting documents for how they propose to live with water. In one of them, these empty skyscrapers are designed as these kind of big vertical sponges. I think this is a fascinating image. We could probably spend hours talking about it, but it's such a weird kind of imaginative geography of Sao Paulo in a very interesting way. So these projects are clearly more experimental than practical. Nevertheless, they're exciting or liberatory dimensions to these new engagements with impermeability and urban flooding, which bring green space to a city that sorely needs it. Linear parks suggest new relationships between cities and their natural environments, highlighting the processual and always emergent nature of urban sites. These types of relational landscapes, piscinões that are open to community control, retention ponds that are liminal by nature, coming and going depending on urban flood tides, infrastructural spaces that serve both drainage and community. These are distinctively hybrid spaces, or in a kind of Donna Haraway-ian vein, we could say they're cyborg spaces. They're efforts to grapple with the urban built environment without heeding the need to see urban nature as a kind of contradiction. And if they actually improve the quality of the water that flows through the city, it's a win-win. But I want to conclude with a few notes of caution. First, I think it's worth noting that in projects like the design that uses empty skyscrapers as sponges, there's a distinct politics to these buildings, many of which are sites of contestation on the part of housing activists and squatters associated with social movements. It's an obvious point, I think, but when confronted with images produced by urban planners and architects, it's important to remember the ways in which these often aestheticize or depoliticize the cities they're representing. They turn the city into kind of ecological systems that lack politics and people. But I think we can also be less abstract. The reality is that while these projects are imagined as important interventions for both local communities and the broader urban community, they entail the eviction and resettlement as constitutive components of them. These projects are predicated on design being used to make spaces unlivable. It's not just an after effect, but a specific goal of many of these projects. The 2009 drainage plan, for instance, makes clear that these projects are predicated on the removal of marginal communities who are currently residing in urban floodplains. Watery Voids does this as well, and Franco is explicit that his designs will be used in part to prevent the illegal occupation of floodplains. And so I think resettlement is perhaps a necessary effect of extracting infrastructure out of Sao Paulo's deeply impermeable landscape. And it's undeniably true that floodplains are often too risky to allow for continuous occupation. It's a real sort of challenge. That being said, I think it's important to remember that these evictions are profoundly classed and geography specific. Corrego Verde project in Vila Madalena is explicitly designed to not displace residents. The projects outlined for peripheral communities, on the other hand, are predicated on the necessary removal of people who inhabit floodplains. I can't speak to the realities of compensation for resettlement. That's sort of the broader question of the dissertation. But I think it's worth keeping in mind that urban sustainable interventions often carry unintended, or we might even say intended, effects for urban residents. But so since this is still a tentative foray into these ideas, I want to focus finally on the discourses surrounding these flood prevention interventions. And I'm going to try and play a short video here, which hopefully will not be a disaster. And in particular, I focus on a continual conflation of informality with environmental degradation. This is not unique to Brazil, but sort of constantly recirculates in sort of contemporary global or mega cities. And so this is a video by DAE in which they sort of tie together these discourses of environmental degradation alongside sort of informal communities. This is very small, I apologize.
A ocupação das margens passou por uma reordenação. As ocupações irregulares em áreas protegidas trazem enorme prejuízo ao meio ambiente e contribuem para as mudanças climáticas. Locais com concentração de moradias irregulares são grandes poluidores de todo o ambiente, pois para se instalarem, destroem as áreas verdes e aumentam a emissão de CO2 na atmosfera. O Parque Várzeas do Tietê vem mudar essa situação.
The narrator later notes, quote, "A população agradece." And I think in one, right, and so, who is this population? And in one compelling image, which you'll see here, we see this kind of park being used to kind of gloss over communities that once were there. So I think it's this invocation of a population that I find really worrisome. This is a type of what we might call a post-political tactic, one that creates a monolithic population who will supposedly benefit from environmental interventions into the landscape. This assumes a normative value to urban environmental projects and ignores the degree to which populations and communities are fractured along lines of class and geography. Furthermore, this video equates informality with degradation, arguing that it's informal settlements who are responsible for environmental harm, rather than the massive industrial processes that are still ongoing in the city. I think videos like this, and I realize this is a limited source, it's sort of a discursive thing, they conflate poverty, informality, and environmental harm, and they give a discursive potency to slum clearance in the name of urban sustainability. This is an old story, blaming the poor for environmental degradation, but it continues to reappear in contemporary discourses of kind of global cityness that we've been talking about. So I'll conclude here. I think the possibility of a spongy city is exciting and suggests new ways of living with disruptive natural systems, but it's important that we not allow environmental logics to be articulated as apolitical interventions. Finding ways to make Sao Paulo more permeable is a project of considerable importance as the city continues to flood. But solutions need to take into consideration not just the logics of hydrological engineers, but the daily lives of urban residents. Flooding is uniquely relational, binds together the city's built environment, its policies, its kind of geography, its climatic context, and broader structures of class and geography. And I think solutions to these problems need to do the same. Thank you.